Sometime in the next decade, guests at Disneyland could walk into a Tomorrowland that actually makes sense for the first time in decades, thematically cohesive and anchored by an advanced next generation Space Mountain. Or Disneyland might just keep the iconic dome wall-top design, and Tomorrowland continues to be exactly what it has been. Tokyo Disneyland Space Mountain was completely demolished, and a newly rebuilt one is opening next year in 2027. Should Disney demolish and rebuild Anaheim Space Mountain? Tokyo Disneyland Space Mountain opened in 1983 as a near-exact replica of the 1977 Anaheim version. 40 years of almost identical history. The same ride, refurbishments, and space-age tin can aesthetic. But in 2022, Tokyo went on its own path. The Oriental Land Company, which owns the Tokyo Disney Resort, announced they'd demolish the entire structure and rebuild from scratch. The reasoning made sense. They reached what they called a developmental ceiling, where more and more refurbishments yielded diminishing returns. They were looking to use a new ride technology, a rumored Omnicoaster system, which is the spinning vehicle tech Disney pioneered in Epcot's Cosmic Rewind. By using this advanced tech, the new ride physically couldn't fit inside the old dome. They also wanted a brand new thematic identity called Earthrise, shifting away from 20th century space travel toward humanity's relationship with Earth, bio-inspired innovation, and the natural world. And they paired the new ride with a reimagined Tomorrowland Plaza in front of it, described as a spectacular world of light and soundscapes. The new Space Mountain Earthrise opens next year in 2027, which raises an obvious question for Anaheim. What Tokyo is proving right now is that the blueprint for Anaheim's next chapter already exists. But first, let's understand why the case for Anaheim getting the same treatment is actually stronger than Tokyo's was. Anaheim Space Mountain is older than Tokyo's. It originally opened in 1977, almost 50 years ago. Through 2024 and 2025, there were reports of increasing intermittent closures, sensor faults, track temperature issues, and multiple shutdowns per day during peak season. The ride is getting old. But the bigger story is the land around Space Mountain. Anaheim's Tomorrowland has been described as being in steady decay for years. The dormant People Mover track has been looping silently overhead for decades. The Star Wars launch bay sits in a building that was once Innoventions, America Sings, and the classic Carousel of Progress before that. There's lots of underused square footage here. The 1998 retheme to a Jules Verne-inspired bronze and copper steampunk aesthetic was a critical and commercial failure. What's left of it awkwardly sits alongside Space Mountain's white space-age dome, the empty People Mover infrastructure, and the disjointed IP-themed attractions, including Star Wars, Buzz Lightyear, and Finding Nemo, that Disney has added or rethemed since. What we now have is what original Imagineer Bob Gurr has called aesthetic incoherence. In other words, 3 generations of Tomorrowland stalked on top of each other with no unifying vision. If Tokyo demolished their Tomorrowland's flagship Space Mountain attraction, Anaheim has an even stronger case for the same treatment, because Anaheim's flagship is older, and the surrounding land is in desperate need of a reset. Here's what really matters. A new Space Mountain could be the anchor for the comprehensive Tomorrowland reset that's been needed for decades. The Wall Street Journal recently confirmed that Walt Disney Imagineering actually proposed a project in 2019 that featured a complete Tomorrowland overhaul with a budget of around $600 million. It was supposed to unify the land's aesthetic and upgrade Space Mountain itself. The plan was rejected because it wasn't projected to provide the return of investment needed to justify it, but the goal was there. And there's also an interesting thematic concept that's been proposed for what a reimagined Anaheim Tomorrowland could look like. Bob Gurr, the Imagineer who designed the original Autopia cars, among many other things, has publicly advocated for a sustainable future Tomorrowland centered on renewable energy, clean transit, and a better tomorrow with sustainable technologies. This included electric vehicles replacing the gasoline Autopia, which Disney is finally doing in 2027. High-torque electric motors generating a sophisticated soundscape instead of internal combustion noise. The optimism of sustainable technologies fully realized. And here's an amazing parallel. Gurr's sustaining future vision overlaps almost perfectly with the Earthrise thematic direction that Tokyo is going. Both leave the 20th century space age narrative and center around humanity's relationship with Earth and nature. This envisions Tomorrowland as a showcase for actual future technologies, sustainability, bio-inspired, in harmony with nature, rather than a museum of 1960s sci-fi aesthetics. A new Anaheim Space Mountain built around these themes wouldn't just be a new ride. It could be the anchor that finally pulls Tomorrowland into a coherent aesthetic for the next generation. Brand new flagship, thematic direction, and entry plaza. The electric Autopia fits perfectly, and the surrounding IP themed attractions can be rethemed to closely match. The land would finally be unified under a single vision. But now let's shift the conversation to whether we should be preserving Space Mountain rather than tearing it down. Walt Disney personally conceived Space Mountain in 1964 with legendary Imagineer John Hench. The 1965 conceptual illustrations by Hench and Herb Ryman establish a signature mid-century futurism architectural look that's been Tomorrowland's iconic visual anchor for nearly 50 years. Over the lifetime of Disneyland, we've watched many of our favorite attractions disappear. So at some point, Disneyland may no longer look and feel like Disneyland anymore. Space Mountain is one of the buildings still standing that Walt himself was directly involved in creating before his death in 1966. This makes it the kind of irreplaceable historical asset that will be forever lost if it's demolished. And why does this matter? Disneyland is running out of attractions that Walt touched. The submarine voyage? Completely rethemed. The Skyway? Gone. The people mover he envisioned as a model for American cities? Abandoned. Each of these decisions made operational sense at the time, and each one made Disneyland slightly less the place that Walt built. Space Mountain falls into this category. So the question is, should Anaheim get a Tokyo Disney style demolition and reimagining? A new Space Mountain built around the Earthrise concept and sustainability themes that utilizes advanced omnicoaster technology that would anchor a Tomorrowland that's finally cohesive for the first time in decades. This would deliver a next generation Tomorrowland that's aligned with Bob Gurr's vision, featuring a future guided by harmony with nature and an electric Autopia. It addresses the accumulated thematic decay of at least 3 decades, but it will cost an iconic Walt-inspired building in the park. Or does Anaheim just keep the classic Space Mountain building, retheme the ride and surrounding Tomorrowland attractions, and accept that Tomorrowland may just continue to be a collection of disjointed futuristic visions? That option preserves the Walt pedigree, the hench architectural look, and nearly 50 years of Disneyland history. It also avoids a multi-year demolition and build phase that would close one of the park's most popular attractions and introduce a ride capacity gap. The answer may ultimately determine what Tomorrowland looks like for the next generation of Disneyland guests. Tokyo Space Mountain opens in 2027, and when it does, guests will experience what a next generation Space Mountain attraction actually looks and feels like, as well as what the new thematic direction does for the entire land. And based on that, Disney can reevaluate how it's going to approach Anaheim. The rejected 2019 reimagining proposal may come back to the table, this time with new data on Tokyo's attendance and guest satisfaction, which will help Imagineering decide what it should do with Tomorrowland and Space Mountain and Anaheim moving forward. So what do you think? Drop your take in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.